John Perkins. I'm a U.S. citizen, born in the United States, raised in the United States. I'm a former economic hitman. We work very much like some of the hitmen for the mafia because we're looking for a favor later. And mafia people have done this, and gangsters have done this for ages. We just do it on a very large level with governments, with countries, huge level. And we're much more professional. We do this in many ways, but perhaps the most common is that economic hitmen will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country. Things that benefit a few very rich people in that country, as well as our own corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor. But these people, the poor people, are left holding a huge debt, and it's so huge that they can't possibly repay it. But in the process of trying to repay it, they create a situation where they can't afford to have good health programs or educational programs. So we economic hitmen go back in and we say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world, like Iraq. And in that way, we've really managed to create this empire. Because the fact of the matter is, we write the laws. We control the World Bank. We control the IMF. We even control the United Nations to a large degree. And so we write the laws. So the things economic hitmen are not illegal. Putting countries in huge debt and then demanding favors in return, that's not illegal. It should be. It isn't. Sometimes we economic hitmen fail to corrupt leaders of other countries, as I failed with Omar Torrijos in Panama and Jaime Roldos in Ecuador. It doesn't often happen, but when it does, then the jackals are sent in. And these are people who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. So when I failed with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama, the jackals went in and assassinated them. On the few occasions where neither the economic hitmen nor the jackals are successful, then and only then do we send in the military. And this is exactly what happened in Iraq. An economic hitman could not corrupt Saddam Hussein, could not bring him around. The jackals couldn't take him out, and so the military was sent in. The first time we sent the military in 1991, we destroyed his military and figured that he had been sufficiently chastised that now he would come around. And so during the 90s, the economic hitmen went back in to try to bring Saddam Hussein around, but he wouldn't give in. If he had, he'd still be running the country and we'd be selling him jets and tanks and everything else he wanted. But he didn't give in. The jackals couldn't assassinate him. His security forces were very good, and he had a lot of look-alike doubles, so his own security men didn't know whether they were guarding him or a double. So neither the economic hitmen nor the jackals succeeded the second time with Saddam Hussein, and at that point we sent in the military again, and this time we took him out, and the rest is history. The precedent for economic hitmen really began back in the early 50s when democratically elected Mossadegh, who was elected in Iran, he was considered to be the hope for democracy in the Middle East and around the world. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. But one of the things that he'd run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. We didn't like that, of course. But we were afraid to do what we normally were doing, which was to send in the military. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him, who always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective.
Bombs overflow Tehran. Army officers shout that Mossadegh has surrendered and his regime as virtual dictator of Iran is ended. Pictures of the Shah are paraded through the streets as sentiment reverses.
So back here in the United States, in Washington, people looked around and said, wow, that was easy and cheap. So this established a whole new way of manipulating countries, of creating empire. The only problem with Roosevelt was that he was a card-carrying CIA agent, and had he been caught, the ramifications could have been pretty serious. So very quickly at that point, the decision was made to use private consultants to channel the money through the World Bank or the IMF or one of the other such agencies, to bring in people like me who worked for private companies, so that if we got caught, there would be no governmental ramifications. When Arbenz became president of Guatemala, the country was very much under the thumbs of United Fruit Company, the big international corporations. And Arbenz ran on this ticket that said, you know, we want to get the land back to the people. And once he took power, he was implementing policies that would do exactly that, give land rights back to the people. United Fruit didn't like that very much. And so they hired a public relations firm, launched a huge campaign in the United States to convince the United States people, the citizens of the United States, and the press of the United States, and the Congress of the United States, that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet, and that if we allowed him to stay in power, the Soviets would have a foothold in this hemisphere. And that at that point in time was a huge fear on everybody's mind, the Red Terror, the Communist Terror. And so, to make a long story short, out of this public relations campaign came a commitment on the part of the CIA and the military to take this man out. And in fact, we did. We sent in planes, we sent in soldiers, we sent in jackals, we sent everything in to take him out, and did take him out. And as soon as he was removed from office, the new guy that took over after him basically reinstated everything to the big international corporations, including United Fruit. Ecuador for many, many years had been ruled by pro-U.S. dictators, often relatively brutal. Then it was decided that they were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office, and his main goal, he said, as president would be to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won, overwhelming, by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And he began to implement these policies to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, okay, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. He wouldn't listen. He was assassinated. As soon as the plane crashed, the whole area was cordoned off. The only people allowed in were U.S. military from a nearby base and some of the Ecuadorian military. When an investigation was launched, two of the key witnesses died in car accidents before they had a chance to testify. A lot of very, very strange things that went on around the assassination of Jaime Roldos. I, like most people who've really looked at this case, had absolutely no doubt that it was an assassination. And of course, in my position as an economic hitman, I was always expecting something to happen to Jaime, whether it be a coup or assassination, I wasn't sure, but that he would be taken down because he was not being corrupted. He would not allow himself to be corrupted the way we wanted to corrupt him. Omar Torrijos, president of Panama, was one of my favorite people. I really, really liked him. He was very charismatic. He was a guy who really wanted to help his country. And when I tried to bribe him or corrupt him, he said, look, John, he called me Juanito. He said, look, Juanito, I don't need the money. What I really need is for my country to be treated fairly. I need for the United States to repay the debts that you owe my people for all the destruction you've done here. I need to be in a position where I can help other Latin American countries win their independence and be free of this terrible presence from the north that you people are exploiting us so badly. I need to have the Panama Canal back in the hands of the Panamanian people. That's what I want. And so, leave me alone. Don't try to bribe me. It was 1981, and in May, Jaime Roldos was assassinated. And Omar was very aware of this. Torrijos got his family together and he said, I'm probably next, but it's okay. because I've done what I came here to do. I renegotiated the canal. The canal will now be in our hands. He just finished negotiating the treaty with Jimmy Carter. In June of that same year, just a couple of months later, he also went down in an airplane crash, which there's no question was executed by sponsored jackals. Tremendous amount of evidence that one of Torrijos's security guards handed him at the last moment as he was getting on the plane a tape recorder, a small tape recorder that contained a bomb. It is interesting to me how this system has continued pretty much the same way for years and years and years, except the economic hitmen have got better and better and better. Then we come up with, very recently, what happened in Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez gets elected president, following a long line of presidents who had been very corrupt and basically destroyed the economy of the country. And Chavez was elected amidst all that. Chavez stood up to the United States, and he's done it primarily demanding that Venezuelan oil be used to help the Venezuelan people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. So in 2002, a coup was staged, which there's no question in my mind, and most other people's minds, that the CIA was behind that coup. The way that that coup was fomented was very reflective of what Kermit Roosevelt had done in Iran, of paying people to go out into the streets to riot, to protest, to say this Chavez is very unpopular. You know, if you can get a few thousand people to do that in television, you can make it look like it's the whole country, and things start to mushroom. Except in the case of Chavez, he was smart enough, and the people were so strongly behind it that they overcame it, which was a phenomenal moment in the history of Latin America. Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in, we try to corrupt governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refused to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate. And once that happens and a new government comes in, boy, it's going to toe the line, because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system. So in '91 we send in the troops and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time, but we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And then once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't. They didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again. So we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in. And in that way, we've really created an empire, but we've done it very, very subtly. It's clandestine. All the empires of the past were built on the military, and everybody knew they were building them. So the British knew they were building them, the French, the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks, and they were proud of it. And they always had some excuse, like spreading civilization, spreading some religion, something like that. But they knew they were doing it. We don't. The majority of the people in the United States have no idea that we're living off the benefits of a clandestine empire. that today there's more slavery in the world than ever before.
In my lifetime, the following countries in Latin America have been assaulted by the United States, directly and indirectly. Their governments replaced by dictators and other pro-Washington leaders.
This is Guatemala City as seen from the air.
In the 1950s, 2% of the population of Guatemala controlled the natural wealth in collusion with giant US corporations like the United Fruit Company, which dominated banana growing. On the board of United Fruit was John Foster Dulles, who happened to be US Secretary of State. His brother Alan happened to run the CIA. Both were Christian fundamentalists who regarded any opposition as the work of communism and the devil. In 1950, this man, Jacobo Arbenz, became the first Guatemalan leader to be democratically elected by a majority of his people, who saw in him the hope of social justice. He was the Hugo Chavez of his day.
What was going on in Guatemala is that there was a democratically elected president in 1950, Jacobo Arbenz, who sought to institute a series of New Deal-style reforms in which the state had a greater role in both developing the economy and redistributing wealth. And the centerpiece of that was a land reform.
Arbenz was far from radical. His land reform policies were modest. But Washington was having none of it. Howard Hunt was then working for Alan Dulles' CIA.
So they said a decision has been made at the highest levels of our government to rid Guatemala of the Arbenz regime, and we would like you to participate in it. You will be the chief of propaganda and political action.
Guatemala, what the CIA did was mobilize every facet of American power. It didn't just isolate Guatemala militarily and diplomatically, but it used the techniques of social psychology in a nearly year-long campaign which created a sense of crisis in Guatemala.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II.
And that's what they did, so that the United States could control the economy of Guatemala, destroying the dreams of its people.
We sowed confusion through the countryside, and of course by this time we had aircraft flying over and dropping leaflets and doing a little harmless bombing.
A little harmless bombing and a CIA terror campaign cost thousands of lives.
In the CIA, we didn't give a hoot about democracy. I mean, it was fine if a government was elected and would cooperate with us, but if it didn't, then democracy didn't mean a thing to us. And I don't think it means a thing today.
Washington would never forgive Fidel Castro.
Under the government aegis, we had task forces that were striking at Cuba constantly. We were attempting to blow up power plants. We were attempting to ruin sugar mills. We were attempting to do all kinds of things during this period. This was a matter of American government policy. This wasn't the CIA.
I remember one particular instance, a brand new secondary school that had opened up in the countryside was going to receive its week's supply of fresh milk, so we could put cement powder into the milk. We declared war on school children. That shouldn't be the policy of the United States government. You don't win friends and influence people that way, declaring war on children and innocent civilians. A big mistake, but the U.S. government orders it and participates in it. And the CIA's goal eventually was to increase this frustration level to a point where there would be a civil revolution within Cuba, bring him down. But, well, this was in the best interest of my country. But as I got to know the Cuban people, we could switch it around and use it as foresight. But in hindsight, yeah, if I could go back and change things, I'd have to go back 30 years. 1965 in my senior year, and to have the memories that I have of the things that I've done to people and countries, and all of it in the name of the United States and under its flag.
Cuba's achievements in healthcare and education are widely respected. However, for not bowing to the greatest power on earth, the Cuban Revolution has paid a high price. A 45-year economic war waged by the United States and the loss of vital democratic freedoms.
How dare you, 90 miles from my country, last 45 years with a different form of government? How dare you haven't allowed American corporations to buy you out? How dare you continue this arrogance that says that you will never succumb to us? Don't you know who we are?
What justified the attacks on Cuba and other Latin American countries was the so-called Red Menace.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck and your face.
Propaganda like this excused every American invasion, every toppling of a government, every assassination, every act of terrorism. The real threat was an orchestrated paranoia in the United States that became a super cult called anti-communism.
The true goal of the United States government is control. And they feel that if the United States did not control the governments of Latin America, then somebody else would. And the principle of government by the people, for the people, of the people, that is that's just silly.
Chile under Allende became an inspiration. In Washington, President Nixon secretly plotted to destroy the Chilean economy. "We're going to make the economy scream," said Nixon. In Santiago, General Pinochet, America's man, sent in his British-made bombers against the presidential palace. It was September the 11th, 1973, a date that held an infamy and irony 28 years later.
My wife and our children were at the house, and they had a marvelous view of these planes winging over and then dipping down and sending their bombs into the Moneda.
In October 1970, the CIA cabled its man in Chile. It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. When that happened 3 years later, a U.S. official cabled back to Washington, Chile's coup d'etat was close to perfect. This is where they tortured and killed them. Villa Grimaldi was once a palatial home in a suburb of Santiago. Under Pinochet, it became a place of horror. Today, it's a memorial to its many victims. Duane Claridge was head of the CIA's Latin American division in the early 1980s.
Chile, the only reason it exists is because of Pinochet.
At a huge human price.
What human price? Give me a break.
The thousands who were disappeared and murdered.
Thousands? You count them. What thousands?
Well,
and
I've
don't
seen...
talk to me about truth commissions.
I've seen their names in the cemetery in Santiago.
Yeah,
you're saying...
Yeah,
you're saying they're
thousands.
fakes?
There aren't thousands.
Well...
There aren't thousands, sir.
There are thousands, each name documented by human rights organizations. It was a period in which almost everybody in the present situation regards as a dark time, in which the CIA played a major role.
That's right. They played a major role in overthrowing, what's his name?
What's his name was Salvador Allende.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
He was democratically elected.
Right, okay.
Is that okay to overthrow a democratically elected government? Is it okay?
It depends on what your national security interests are.
Are you denying that Pinochet caused huge suffering in that country?
I don't buy. That he committed crimes, I agree.
Mm-hmm. But it's worth it.
Huh?
Is that what you're saying? Those crimes are worth it?
Yeah. Sometimes, unfortunately, things have to be changed in a rather ugly way.
Levántate y mira la montaña, de donde viene el viento, el sol y el agua.
You use virtually any method necessary to get what you want.
Torture?
And killing.
Kill them?
Killing. If there's someone you don't want, you kill them. If you can't get the information you want, if you can't get that person to shut up or stop what they're doing, you simply assassinate them, and you assassinate them with one of your death squad.
This is a death squad in action in El Salvador. Actually, it's the National Police, many of whom were trained at the School of the Americas. Here on the steps of San Salvador Cathedral, they're gunning down mourners attending the funeral of Archbishop Romero, who was murdered as he said Mass on March the 23rd, 1980. According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human...
Let me, John. This is where we're going. You're wasting my time. That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
So it was bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years.
We can count 200 in this one village alone. They were mostly women and children, systematically murdered in just one day and night in December 1981 in the village of El Mazote. The killers belonged to a special battalion of the El Salvador Army trained by the United States. There were few survivors. I reported America's war against Nicaragua, which had the temerity to overthrow a Washington-backed dictator, Somoza. The CIA attacked Nicaragua with death squads known as the Contra. Why did Washington attack such tiny countries? Because the weaker they are, the greater the threat. People who can free themselves against all the odds are sure to inspire others. What right have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries?
National security interests.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say in this.
Well, that's just tough. We are going to protect ourselves, and we're going to go on protecting ourselves because we end up protecting all of you. And let's not forget that.
Right. Right? No, I won't.
We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. Get used to it, world. We're not going to put up with nonsense. And if our interests are threatened, we're going to do it.
An American Roman Catholic nun, Sister Diana Ortiz, experienced this at first hand as a missionary. In 1989, after speaking out about the brutal treatment of the indigenous people, she was kidnapped.
In 1989, November 2nd, I was abducted and I was put in a police car, blindfolded, and taken to a military installation in Guatemala City, known as the Política. which still exists today. I was taken to a basement, and I still remember to this day, upon entering the building, the clandestine prison, hearing the screams of people being tortured. Can you stop?
For 24 hours, she was tortured and gang raped. During her ordeal, she identified the leader of the gang as a fellow citizen of the United States.
I came out a totally different person, but also with new eyes and more attuned to the hurting, the brokenness, the oppression, the deceit of my government. I've heard people say that what happened in Abu Ghraib is an isolated incident. And I have to just shake my head and say, are we on the same planet? Aren't you aware of our history? Isn't history taught in the classroom about the role of the U.S. government in human rights violations?